All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Thomas Stagg from Novogradac and Company. Apparently, I don't know how to use Zoom, uh, but we have the exciting topic today to talk about the Community Reinvestment Act. And those of you who self-select into this panel, I don't know who you are because you got to be more geeky than me who would purposely want to come and talk about Community Reinvestment Act. But it's an interesting topic, and it's very a hot topic right now with everything that's going on. So we'll talk about what's happening to community investment, the change, and kind of what the future holds. But just to do a little bit of groundwork, and I really enjoyed, I don't know how many of you guys were on the earlier panel about advancing affordable and equitable transit-oriented development with Patience from HDC, and she really talked through a lot of the reasons why the Community Reinvestment Act came into being back in 1977. It was really formed to address the redlining that we had where there were no lending to low or moderate income households, and they were really just blocked out of being able to access any sort of the lending that's needed to have small businesses, needed to purchase a home, et cetera, et cetera. So this really grew out of that. And now over the years, it's had many iterations, but we really haven't had a big update to the Community Reinvestment Act since 1995. And I'm going to age myself a little bit here. I graduated high school shortly thereafter, and I can tell you the world has changed a lot since then, especially in the banking world with online banking, how much more sophisticated we've become, how much the internet's impacted us, getting back to Dr. T's presentation. And so, obviously CRA needed to be updated. And so it will talk about the proposed update and the shortfalls and weaknesses of that. I'm going to share my screen now. And a couple of little tips here. If you're having issue getting sound, which if you can hear me tell you this, it's probably not going to be any good, but in the top left-hand corner, there's a little green circle. The next to that's a little white circle with I think an exclamation point in it. If you click on there, you can find the password to join via Zoom if you're having sound issues. And of course, if you have questions as we go, drop those into the chat because those will be monitored and sent to me. And all the slides will be available for us afterwards. So Community Reinvestment Act, it's really important in affordable housing. And part of the reason for that is that 85% of the annual investment in the low-income housing tax credit is from CRA motivated banks. And so the LIHTC equity market was estimated to be 17 billion. So just trying to do quick math, 85% of that, somewhere around 14 to 15 billion dollars of investment in tax credit was driven by this. Now, if you're looking at new market tax credits, it's an even greater percentage. Some people estimate that maybe even up to 100% of all the investment in new market tax credit projects is from CRA motivated banks because it lines up so well with CRA areas that it's a real win-win. And the National Park Service estimates that 50% of historic tax credit projects are located in low or moderate income census tracts. So again, really getting into the assessment areas where community reinvestment would be done. And so when we talk about, more about historic projects. So when we talk about the CRA regulations, we need to understand that there are 3 different CRA agencies. And unfortunately, right now, they're not all aligned with these new proposed changes. But the most important one of these 3 is the OCC, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency. And the reason why they're most important is about 70% of the banks are covered by OCC. So kind of where they go is where CRA is going to go because they cover the vast majority of the institutions. And so the OCC is very, very important when we start talking about CRA. So if we flip forward here, about 2 years ago, in April of 2018, Treasury sent out a notice and said, hey, we need to look at updating and reforming the CRA because it's really kind of outdated and antiquated. And in fact, when they sent this out, they received over 7,500 comments about areas that need to be updated and changed. So clearly the industry was very interested in CRA being updated and changed. And some of the comments that came from this, this is according to the Comptroller of the OCC. So he said that 94% of the comments stated that the CRA framework lacked objectivity, transparency, and fairness. He also stated that 98% of the comments said that the CRA is applied inconsistently, and 88% of the comments conclude that the CRA was hard to understand. So the CRA was somewhat kind of antiquated, hard to understand, and there's various ways that people were maybe grade inflating, as they call it, trying to game the system in their favor, and maybe wasn't seeing the outcome that we were really hoping for, that truly this would lead to more lending in low and moderate income areas and would lead to more community reinvestment from the banks. And so when they said, let's go ahead and do some reform here, they said we should really focus on the following areas. First, the assessment area. And the assessment area is the areas that the bank has to reinvest in. And they wanted to kind of look at that and say, is the assessment area framework still correct after all the online banking and things like that? Are we still kind of getting the assessment area right? So we'd love to have comments about how we should be changing the assessment areas. And then they also wanted comments about, what sort of examination clarity and consistency. How should this framework be done, and how should we be scored in looking at this? And then just kind of looked at everything under the sun as well. We have this other one comment here that captures other items that should be addressed, looking at the disparate treatment of debt and equity, impact of the treatment of non-banks and CRA requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So it was definitely time for an update. People wanted an update. And so the OCC issued their advanced rulemaking saying, hey, we're going to do this. Let us know your thoughts on how we should do this. And in their list, you can see this. And again, I'm going to make these slides available. These slides are very word heavy. I'm not going to read everything on the slides back to you. And a little bit later on, we're going to go quickly through some of the slides. But the slides will be available if you want to come back and read about this a little bit more. But basically, the CRA, the OCC said in their advanced notice of rulemaking is they want to know how we can go about increasing lending and services to people in areas that need it most, including low and moderate income areas. That's what LMI stands for. Revisit how assessment areas are defined. Again, very much in line with what Treasury wanted them to do. Making CRA performance more transparent. So trying to answer this question of why it's very hard for banks really to know what their grade is and have this transparency. And of course, since it is the OCC and they're in charge of kind of advocating for the interest of their members, reducing the costs and burden relating to evaluating performance under the CRA, they'd rather have their money focused on helping those in low and moderate income areas as opposed to spending money just proving out that they had done that. Now, of course, they received comment letters from all the big advocacy groups related to tax credits, so the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, the New Market Tax Credit Coalition, as well as the Historic Tax Credit Coalition. And they all kind of submitted kind of the same information. You'll see these 4 bullet points are the same on all these slides, as they were suggesting that they revise the framework, that they redefine the areas of assessment, and they expand qualifying activities so that more activities could qualify for the benefit. And you can access all these comment letters on our website if you'd like to. So now we have a little bit of the history. In April of 2018, the memo from Treasury went out asking OCC, the Federal Reserve, and FDIC to rewrite their regs, give us more clarity, better address our needs. The OCC issued their advance notice of rulemaking. Then we had the comment period. And then finally, in April 10th, they met on OCC reforms, had their meeting, and then they talked about their meeting. But this is the most important one out here, January 9th of this year. The OCC published their proposed rule. And we're going to talk about the rule in a little bit, and to say it was met with criticism is, to put it lightly, probably the best way to say this is this rule ended up being very partisan, in the sense that if the Republicans were very much in favor of it and Democrats were very much opposed to it, and I'll read some comments in a second about that, but it's just important to understand that this ended up being very partisan, and maybe this is a good time to pause and, well, let's talk about it in a second. So let's look first at kind of where we're at right now. what the current structure looks like. So currently under CRA, and again, this is a very simplified chart of it. As I said, there's a lot of people complain that it was applied inconsistently and the framework was unclear, lacked objectivity. But basically, this is how it worked. You were judged in these 4 areas, and they had different weights. And so you had to have a lending test, which was originating mortgages, small business loans, community development loans, including affordable housing. And so that's why you'll see if you work in affordable housing, a lot of the lenders don't, or sorry, a lot of your investors and partners don't just want to do the equity only. They also are very interested in your debt because that also satisfies their community reinvestment requirements. And then there was the investment test. And that's the big one for us because under the investment test, that included things like new market tax credits, historic tax credits, low-income housing tax credits. So every bank had to meet the investment test. And so that drove this requirement for them to find these sort of investments. And so the tax credits that we work with were always very attractive in that. And that led to, some very competitive pricing, and also why 85% of all tax credits are purchased by CRA motivated banks. So this is the old framework. Now we come to the new framework. And the new framework looks quite different. And it's really just focused more on the volume of CRA activity divided by the bank's domestic deposits. And we're going to talk all about this, but it really makes it quite a different framework. And again, the activities still include a lot of the similar stuff that used to count, but there's also a lot more that's picked up now. First, we'll see here, there's no separate test now for lending, investment, or services test. It's really just a volume-based test. And on that, activity includes mortgages, small business loans, consumer loans, community development loans, and investments. And we see that all the old stuff that used to qualify would still qualify, and we'll look at some new stuff that now qualifies. And then also change the metric for assessment areas and bank-wide. So now activities outside of assessment areas count if bank passes metrics in the most of their assessment areas. And this has pros and cons to it, and we'll talk more about those as well, but kind of put a pin in that one because that's going to be kind of an important thing that we talk about. And then finally, equity investments, which again, equity investments are investments in tax credit projects, whether it's historic, new markets, low-income housing tax credits, that those sort of investments get a 2 times multiplier. So for every $1 you invest, it counts as $2. So there still is some incentive to invest in tax credits, but it's very unclear if that incentive is going to be enough to overcome the shifting of the overall weight. So looking forward, so before we kind of get down into the weeds on this, I wanted to kind of put this up here, and we're going to jump into the weeds in a second, but I think it's important to note that this is a very bipartisan, or very not bipartisan, very partisan proposal. In fact, I'll read a couple of quotes from some people in Congress. So Senator Sherrod Brown, a Democrat from Ohio, who is the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, said, "The proposal undermines a basic principle we have agreed on to in this country for nearly 50 years, that banks should serve their customers and their communities. In 2009, it is shameful that Trump regulators are ready to cast aside that principle and trample on the fundamental civil rights laws and Community Reinvestment Act by pushing aside those who need access to the banking system, including communities of color and rural communities." Several civil rights organizations joined to condemn the proposal, saying OCC and FDIC, who joined on to this, ignored their request to invite a return to, and invites a return to discrimination against communities, colors, and low and moderate income. So it was very much not favored by the Democrats and by civil rights organizations. Although, some people said, hey, we got to wait and see how this plays out. And we do have a quote from Senator Mike Crapo, a Republican from Idaho, who's also on the Senate Banking Committee. He's the chairman. So the proposed rules would encourage more investment, lending, and services where they are needed most. So as you can see, it's very hotly contested. And the reason why I mention that is we're going to spend the next little while kind of digging into this. But it's important to know, and we'll look at some of this at the end as well, that it is highly likely that if Biden wins the presidential election and Trump is not reelected, that this whole proposal will be scrapped. It will be thrown out and a new proposal will come. And so that's why you're going to see some of these slides are just here for your reference, so you can have them. And we're going to go quickly over a lot of these because in a lot of ways, it all depends on what happens with the election. This would be a much more interesting conversation to have in January once we know who's won, or maybe November, once you understand who's won the election, because it's highly probable, pretty much everybody you talk to tells you if Biden wins, this CRA regulation is going to be scrapped. And then another important point to point out is that this doesn't go into place till really December 31st, 2023. So there's still a lot of time for this to be put in place. But what we're seeing right now in the market is investors are kind of being forced to do a little bit of a wait and see here, because they know this is really going to change their CRA investment and going to change how things are weighted. And they need to understand what this is going to happen before they start contributing, committing more and more money to these projects. And so if you're working on a project, you might see that you're having a hard time closing with investors right now. And this is a big part of that, just due to the fact that it's unknown. And sometimes I think having something unknown is worse than having an adverse outcome in our industry. Don't quote me on that, because I'm sure there's lots of things that I'd rather have unknown than the adverse impact. But the fact that this is unknown, it's causing this pause. Whereas if it was known, then we'd be able to say, well, let's take our steps and figure out what we need to do to still make our programs work in this framework. But the fact that it's unknown is causing kind of a bigger disruption, because it's putting everything on hold really until the election. So if we start to dig a little bit more into this, we see that now that there's two different types of loans that we're going to, broad categories we're going to look at. Retail loans, these are the loans you think of consumer and home loans, small business loans to low-income persons or in moderate income communities. So kind of this is to address the redlining that we had, trying to make debt more accessible to these types of individuals. But then also we see an expansion of what's considered community development loans and investments. And we see that community facilities have been expanded in the past, as we'll talk about in a second, or I'll have a slide on in a second. It used to only count if it was primarily benefiting lower moderate income communities. Now, as long as they can prove out that it's meeting at least 50%, they get full credit. If it drops below 50%, they get a prorated credit. So there's a concern that that's going to cause a shift to different types of investment. And so we see that that's been a little bit expanded here. And then the other big change is this top bullet point here, that loans and investments are valued based on the average month end on the balance sheet dollar value, not the amount originated during the assessment period. And why that's important, as we'll talk about in a second, I'm just going to kind of give you a little sneak peek, is that it puts a bigger emphasis on your balance sheet as opposed to the number of loans you're doing, and puts a bigger emphasis on the dollar amount of the loans as opposed to the number of loans you're doing. So there's some concern that this is going to make it harder for smaller loans and low and moderate income to get funded, and people are going to chase kind of bigger projects. And also that it's going to make it so that people want to get the big community development projects from this previous slide, a hospital, school, something like that, because it's just a dollar amount. In the past, you got credit for the number of originations that you did as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the good news is banks will get double CRA bonus for community development investments that we're used to, loans to support affordable housing, investments in affordable housing through equity investments. They'll still get double credit. So we are pretty, that's the one kind of silver lining here. So let's talk about some of our key takeaways and concerns. The biggest one is that with all these new activities, is this going to crowd out the investments that have historically qualified? And there's just a really big concern that the money is going to be chasing other items. For example, the third bullet point, financial literacy, homebuyer counseling, now includes all clients, which is a great program. Great that we have financial literacy and home buying consulting or counseling, but it used to only apply, you used to only get credit if it was for low-income clients. And so there was a big emphasis on seeking out and finding low-income clients as opposed to just having the classes. Now it's going to shift maybe back to just having the classes. And again, the balance sheet approach as opposed to originations. This is a big concern because could it end up decreasing? So historically, you would originate a loan, then often it would be sold off into a secondary market. And that's a business practice of many originators. And there's concern now that if they only care about the balance sheet balance, that once you meet your target, they're going to have no incentive to increase community development loans and investments. So they met their target, they can just hold it, and there's no kind of requirement to do new originations. So there's a big concern about that, and we've already talked about the double credit a couple times here. So again, looking at the pros and cons here, mainly the cons, sorry, the concerns, I guess I should call them, not cons, is that, that the shift in the community development loans and investment services would no longer have this primary purpose of community development targeted on low or moderate income individuals and areas. And so is this going to have a shift of moving CRA away from the lower moderate income market? And will there also be a shift that we have more concern on the dollar volume and less about the impact of the activities? Because again, it's not that threefold test. It's now just your investments over your bank balance. So there's a big concern that this is going to be a shift away from that. And then finally on this slide, this quote at the top is coming from the former FDIC chair. And he says, we do not know how, let's see, I want to be on the next slide. We do not know how many or where these deposit-based assessment areas might be. So this is talking about the assessment areas as we're kind of moving away to let it impact other communities than it historically has, or how they would benefit low and moderate income communities. It's not clear that communities that are so-called credit deserts would necessarily benefit from this new 5% thresholds. And so what the concern is that this new assessment area is going to favor retail and community development activities around the country over local credit needs because the assessment area has been expanded and looking at new area. And so anyways, these are the concerns we have with the current proposal. I think since there's a good chance that this proposal might not go through, we've kind of examined the concerns probably enough about this. Now, I don't know if there's any questions. I'm not sure how to see the questions when I'm in this presenter mode. Here we go, maybe. Nope, I don't see any coming in yet if I'm looking in the right spot. So it sounds like I've kind of hit on the high points here and we kind of understand the issues. But again, so the real concern here is that there's going to be a shift on the CRA. So first off, I think it's great to go back and remember CRA has been a long time since it's been updated, and everybody agrees that an update should happen. Maybe not everybody. It's hard to get 100% consensus, right? But most people agree that there should be some sort of update to CRA. The concern is that this OCC update is really too much in favor of the banks and not kind of I don't want to sound as though the banks are the one who's driving this, but too much in the favor of banks and shifting away from low and moderate income. And I don't know, I was just really impressed by the conversation this morning with patients. I kind of looked at this history of our country and how redlining has impacted it, and to see that the CRA is maybe being scaled back so it won't have that same benefit is kind of troubling to a lot of people, as we looked at in the quotes I read earlier. And so let's keep going forward here. And so now we talk about how's this going to impact the credits that we work with. And as I said at the beginning, I'm a partner at Novogradac and Company. I work with low-income housing tax credits probably 90% of my time. I have a few historic projects here and there and some renewable energies, et cetera, but mainly working with low-income housing tax credits and developers. And I see how impactful this credit pricing can be from a CRA investor, and how meaningful having more equity to a project is for us to either be able to lower our rents to deeper targeting, support less debt, do more sort of services on the project. And so CRA has been very, very meaningful. And so with this shift, the concern is that we're going to see less demand for these credits, which would mean lower credit pricing, which ultimately makes it harder to get deals done. And of course, our industry is awesome. We'll figure it out. We'll figure out how to get deals done regardless of kind of what the credit price is to a certain extent. You know, we got projects done at 80 cents on the dollar. We get projects done at a dollar for the credits. But this uncertainty right now is definitely causing issues because we need to know what kind of projects to plan for. And that's the biggest impact on LIHTC right now, is we don't understand what sort of projects are coming out. Oh, I see somebody raise their hand. I'm not sure how I get to that, or unless you're just saying, I agree. And new markets, again, new markets driven 100% almost by Community Reinvestment Act. And so if that is an area you work in, you should definitely be concerned about the changes. So if you do have a question or comment, go ahead and drop it into, I think it's called the polls panel, and it will show up for me. All right, and then historic tax credit, similar. So now I think it's kind of interesting to shift and say, well, where do we go from here? What is the expectation? How are things going to change? And I thought that to do that, we'd kind of look at the upcoming presidential election. Now, I don't know if you've been to one of our conferences and you've heard Mike Novogradac do his Washington Wire, or Peter Lawrence. You know, they're much more into Washington, D.C. than I am. I'm more of a Washington State kind of guy. And so a lot of this, I'm just going to try and do my best Mike Novogradac impression here. But when we look at the 2020 election, we sit back and say there's three likely results. We're pretty certain that the House is going to stay Democratic. That's not really up for question. The president, there's a chance that's either going to stay with Trump or flip to Democrats with Biden. Now, you'll see up here, there really isn't any case where we're saying that there's a chance that, so it's either going to flip with Biden. There isn't really a good chance that somehow the presidency would flip to Democrat, and that the Senate would stay, that the president would win the election, and that the Senate would change to Democrat, just because in order for the president to win, how voting would go, that the Senate would likely stay Republican. So you don't see that up here. You don't see Trump with Democrat House and Democrat Senate. And so these are kind of the three likely outcomes that would happen. And so if we look at this, I'm not going to go into the key Senate committee leaders if Democrats win, other than to say, you know, Senator Wyden, our neighbor to the south, has been very, very much an advocate for affordable housing, been a great partner. In fact, he keynoted our conference last week and gave a great talk about how important tax credits have been to his community and how important low-income housing tax credits are. Okay, and then the other people from the Democratic Party that would come up have all been kind of supporters of the low-income housing tax credit. So we see with these three different likely outcomes kind of what our path forward as an industry would be, assuming that I'm talking about the broader industry of housing, not just tax credits, because, you know, Senator Wyden, he has the middle income tax credit. I can't remember the acronym, MITEC. That's different than the low-income housing tax credits. That's trying to reach up to a even higher middle net income. And so we see that for our overall industry, including HUD, that if the kind of status quo remains, we kind of stay in our status quo, right? We're kind of feeling like we're just trying to protect ourselves and not give back any resources that we have. And we're taking a very kind of defensive path if that should happen. Now, if the presidency turns to Biden, who has been very kind of pro-housing, and it stays Republican in the Senate, we're going to try and seek resources, but it's going to be more difficult. So that's going to be what we call the modest offensive plan, where we're trying to get more resources, but it's not going to be as good as a third scenario where everything flips to all Ds, so all Democrats. And in that case, then I think that our advocates in the Senate and House are going to become very aggressive and very much looking to get more resources for housing. And we see this with the House, and we'll talk about in a second with HR 2, where the House has had this very kind of aggressive plan of what they want to accomplish in the Senate and accomplish to with their housing goals. And of course, as we said, if the presidency flips to Democrat, then the CRA structure that we currently have proposed from the OCC will likely be repealed, and we'll have something new. Now, unfortunately, that does open up a little bit more window of uncertainty, but then any plan to be implemented will be pushed even further down the road, and it's likely that we'd see people going back to kind of following the status quo plan, I would hope. It'd be great if I had an investor here to tell me where I'm speaking wrong about what their plans are. Okay, so we just released this report that we've called the blue wave effect that talks about what would happen if the Democrats were to retake the Senate. And again, we think if the Democrats retake the Senate, that it is likely they take the president, but not guaranteed. And so we see if this does happen, that we have this whole report that talks about how different programs would work, and we look at some of the key elections are happening for the Senate out there. So very interesting. If you're interested in that, let me know. But so then that shifts over. So community reinvestment, again, it kind of hinges on what happens with the election. That's why we're talking about this in this Community Reinvestment Act panel. And the election is really going to dictate what happens with this OCC proposal, because as we know, it's not very favored by Democrats at all. And let's see, we have a question coming in. Yeah, great question. The question is talking about, so when we're talking about these assessment areas, has there been any discussion about looking and revisiting qualified census tracts or distressed areas to account for kind of the historic gentrification and historic low and moderate income minority communities? And there really hasn't been any talk to kind of change that and update for the upcoming census. I think that that's something that's still kind of in the works and in the future. As of right now, they're still kind of using the current, there's been no talk about changing the definition of a low or moderate income for CRA purposes. So kind of coming back and looking forward a little bit, we see that there's kind of two legislations that's out there that we're looking at pushing forward for housing advocacy. And one is the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which everybody in Washington State should be very familiar with. It's chaired by, on the Senate side, with Maria Cantwell, obviously a Democrat from Washington. And then on the House side, it's chaired by Representative Del Bene, also a Democrat from Washington. And it has great bipartisan support. You can see that updated of just 2 weeks ago of how many sign-ons we have. But again, it's going to be kind of hard to get through. One thing we have seen is the use of housing bonds has skyrocketed since 2015. This is really an amazing chart to look at to see how much more housing we're getting built. And there's really kind of two things that are helping with that. One is definitely credit pricing, which is heavily impacted by CRAs. This high credit pricing that we've experienced for the last little while definitely makes bond transactions very feasible. The second is that we've had great rent growth recently, which makes it easier to finance these tax-exempt bond projects that typically don't have as much other assistance on them as maybe a 9% project would. And so those two things have really contributed to this explosion of the amount of tax-exempt bond projects that are being built. And so the one big area of emphasis in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act is on this 4% floor. Now, for the non-tax credit junkies out there who are still hanging out here as we've kind of shifted a little bit further away from CRA, is that the 4% floor sets a floor for kind of how much equity you would receive on a project. And this floor, kind of all things being considered equal, increases the amount of equity by a third on a bond project. So that means that you have to have less debt in order to make this project work. And so this 4% floor, we estimate would generate about 126,000 new homes over the next 10 years. But if we break this down by state, we see Washington State would generate about 6,000 additional units, which is great. And if you look at that, I'm always impressed by Washington State. We do such an amazing job, because if you look at where we would fall on the population compared to how many units we produce with our bonds, we're about the third highest, according to this, producer of bonds in the country. But yet we have, sorry, fourth. I missed New York up there. They're an amazing, huge producer. But we're definitely not the fourth largest state in the nation. And that's because the state has really put a priority on using bonds for housing and has really been very proactive about getting them out. And in fact, almost to our detriment, we've been so good at it that now it's become competitive. We don't have enough bonds to house all the units that we would like to. But a 4% floor would definitely help with that. And another issue with bonds that, if I flash back to last Housing Washington, I can think of 3 or 4 people who came up to me and said, hey, we're running into bond cap issues. Can't we just change this 50% test? So there's this test in bonds that says 50% of your project has to be financed with tax-exempt bonds. So if you have, just using simple math here, a $100 million project, you have to have bonds of at least $50 million on that. So you can see how that would chew through the bond cap very quickly. So the question became, what would happen if we changed that down to lower percentages? So with the help of the National Council of State Housing Agencies, we did a study and said, if you drop it to 40%, it would increase homes between 177,000 and 355,000, depending on how much gap financing was scalable. But if we go all the way down to dropping it 25%, we'd see that would produce over 1.4 million homes over the next 10 years, which when you look at the housing shortage, we definitely need that and more. And then one more piece of legislation is and this is interesting because this gets back to our earlier look and say, if Democrats were able to capture all 3 branches of, branches isn't the right term there. I'm definitely not a political science major. I'm an accountant. And this is probably the most presentation I've done with the least amount of numbers. I'm getting out of my bailiwick here. I haven't had to use my calculator once on this presentation. But if we say, hey, we're going to have the Democrats will have the presidency, Senate, and House, I think you'd look and say, what is their kind of goals? And you'd look at HR 2 and you'd say, this is what the goal of a Democrat-controlled Senate, House of Representatives, and President would look to do. And there's a lot in here, and a lot of it is very helpful to our industry. And chief of those is the minimum 4% floor that we've talked about, 126,000 units over 10 years. Second would be increasing the 9% credit, basically doubling the 9% credit that's available. And again, that's going to have this huge impact. If we had twice as much 9% credits, we could generate twice as much housing. Expand the amount of bonds that we have. So expand PABs, that fourth bullet point from the bottom, private activity bonds, so that we're not in this scenario where we have this shortage. And you know what? I think that in a state like ours, no matter how much in bonds they gave us, we'd probably have a shortage because we have that much housing needs and we have that many good developers that they would continue to use it and figure out ways to get it done. And so any additional bonds they give us, we're going to use and we're going to build housing with those. But it's not just tax credits and bonds. It's more affordable housing programs like HUD through the home funds and through additional HUD authorizations to really expand housing, not just low-income housing tax credits, but HUD programs as well, so that you could have more housing for those who need it. And so we went and did an estimate of this. And if you look at our estimate, we estimated that if HR 2 passed, that there'd be an additional $1 million of units generated over 10 years. Right now, we're working on the state-by-state estimate, so we'll let you know shortly how that would impact Washington State. But again, Washington State does very well for itself in these because it's such a good state at using its finite resources. So that looks at our 9%. And then the final question is, how do we get any of these passed, right? Is there any hope for the end of this year that we'll be able to get the 4% floor? Mainly is what we're focused on, 4% floor and some relief on the 50% test. And realistically, we have a couple of vehicles to do this. Probably the most hopeful would be any sort of COVID-19 relief legislation or a year-end tax bill. And it's really unknown what's going to happen. We're hopeful still that something will get done. If something gets done, kind of what we hear out of DC is that the 4% floor is the most likely to get done, and then maybe a little bit of relief on the 50% test for kind of 2 years here to address for cost overruns for COVID. And so that's kind of where we're at here with the state of this. We have 4 minutes. I don't want to have you be late to Friends of Washington or Friends of Housing. And if you're a friend of housing, you're a friend of Washington. I think that's probably safe to say. But we'll open it for any questions. I know we got a little bit kind of maybe more into the election than some people signed up for at the end there, but I think it's important because not only does that impact CRA, it impacts really everything that we're trying to do. And just as a reminder, go out and vote. Even if you're not voting for who I want you to vote, I want you to vote. I want your voice to be heard, and I want us to be active in elections. And so that's my final plug there. Any questions? If not, you can have a little water break before our call. All right. Great. Yep, the question is, when we talk about that infrastructure bill, coming back here, is there any talk about bringing forward an infrastructure bill to new build housing, or is infrastructure only related to roads, bridges, et cetera? And infrastructure is mainly focused on roads, bridge, et cetera, that sort of infrastructure. But there's a lot of hope that if anything happens with infrastructure, that we'll be able to hook onto that, because as we know all too well that housing is infrastructure, right? If we're talking about freeway congestion, well, if we had housing closer to where we worked, would that help with our freeway congestion? Housing is, I know hospitals isn't exactly infrastructure, but housing is healthcare, right? Having good, safe housing helps with healthcare. So realistically, it's been kind of framed more as roads, bridges, et cetera, but we're hopeful that if an infrastructure bill went forward, that we would get some housing components into it, and that there'd be money there for HUD, there'd be money there for transit-oriented development, there'd be money in there for those sort of things. So yeah, great question. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. And talking about CRA, I'm always worried that it's going to be too boring, but it kept me interested, probably because I'm standing up and had to talk. So thank you, everybody. And hopefully I'll see you in person next year, where it's so much better at Housing Washington when we're together in person. Thanks.